There is a deeply humiliating, agonizing sensation that almost every single human being has experienced, yet very few possess the courage to admit. It is the paralyzing feeling of spending an entire afternoon, or lying awake late into the cold hours of the night, with your heart violently racing and your mind boiling over a completely useless, trivial argument. You replay the words in your head. You construct the perfect, devastating response that you should have said. You allow a careless stranger, a deeply toxic colleague, or an ungrateful family member to move inside your mind, rent a massive space in your psychology completely free of charge, and aggressively drain the absolute last drop of your inner peace. You feel physically exhausted, entirely consumed by anger, and utterly powerless because someone else is holding the remote control to your nervous system. You believe you are weak. You believe you lack emotional control. Listen to me with absolute surgical clarity. This catastrophic leakage of your vital energy is not a fundamental flaw in your character. You are experiencing a biological phenomenon known in modern neuroscience as an amygdala hijack. Your primitive evolutionary brain was designed to keep you alive in a brutal physical world. It cannot differentiate between a literal physical predator hunting you in the dark forest and a condescending passive-aggressive remark made by a coworker. When your ego is threatened, your biology instantly floods your bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline, triggering a chemical war inside your own veins to fight a ghost. You are physically bleeding for an illusion. Today, we are going to permanently sever the strings of this pathetic marionette. I am going to reveal the 4 martial disciplines of emotional sovereignty, heavily inspired by the private, blood-stained journal of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. I will teach you how to forge an impenetrable inner citadel, rendering you psychologically lethal and entirely untouchable by the chaos of the external world. But listen with unshakable reverence. The 4th discipline is the dark abyss. It is the terrifying threshold where an estimated 99% of people completely crumble and fail, because it demands the bloody, ruthless execution of an identity that your ego loves more than anything else. If you are truly ready to drop the illusion, surrender the comfort of your suffering, and become a sovereign force of nature, walk with me now. Settle your physical body. Anchor your feet deeply into the floor. Lower your center of gravity and let the chaotic, buzzing frequencies of the modern world fall completely silent. To forge a mind that cannot be broken, we must first deeply understand why the mind breaks in the first place. This brings us to the first martial discipline of emotional sovereignty, the absolute, cold calibration of your reality and the logic of betrayal. The vast majority of human suffering does not come from the actual events that transpire in the physical world. The suffering is violently manufactured in the vast empty space between your expectations and reality. You walk out of your front door every single morning carrying a fragile, deeply naive hallucination. You expect people to be rational. You expect them to be kind, fair, and logically sound. You expect that if you treat the world with respect, the world is contractually obligated to treat you with respect in return. And when the world inevitably shatters this fragile hallucination, when the colleague betrays you, when the stranger insults you, when the driver cuts you off in traffic, you collapse into a state of furious, indignant shock. You ask the universe, how could they do this? Why are they acting this way? You must realize that asking why a chaotic person is acting chaotically is the most pathetic, energy-draining question a human being can possibly ask. It is the language of the prey. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the most powerful man on the face of the earth, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, commanded legions of soldiers and ruled an empire that spanned continents. He was surrounded by assassins, political snakes, sycophants, and traitors. Yet he maintained a mind of absolute glacial stillness. In his private journal, which was never meant to be read by the public, he wrote a profound psychological directive for his own survival. He told himself that he must begin every single morning by saying, "Today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. Do you understand the devastating martial genius of this posture? The emperor was not being a pessimist. He was acting as an apex strategist. He was pre-calibrating his nervous system to the undeniable, brutal reality of human nature. In the natural world, if you walk into the deep forest and a wild wolf bares its teeth and snarls at you, you do not feel morally offended. You do not write a long, emotional paragraph in your journal about how unfair it is that the wolf does not understand your kind intentions. You do not complain about the wolf's lack of manners. You simply accept that it is the fundamental nature of the wolf to be aggressive, and you act accordingly. If you step outside and a violent, freezing rainstorm begins to pour from the sky, soaking your clothes to the bone, you do not scream at the clouds. You do not demand an apology from the sky. You understand that the rain is simply doing what the rain was designed to do. Why then do you lose your absolute mind when a toxic, deeply insecure human being acts according to their nature? When you are offended by the ignorance or malice of another person, it is entirely your own fault, because your defense system was configured to an imaginary universe that does not exist. You are expecting the rain to be dry, and you are crying when you get wet. To become psychologically lethal, you must adopt the cold, clinical eye of the biologist. You look at the narcissist, the manipulator, the angry stranger, and you observe them exactly as you would observe a sudden change in the weather. They are governed by their own unhealed trauma, their own massive insecurities, and their own pathetic lack of self-mastery. Their toxic behavior is not a personal attack against your sovereign soul. It is merely a biological symptom of their own internal disease. Neuroscience shows us that disappointment and anger are triggered by a massive prediction error in the brain. Your brain predicted a polite, rational interaction, and the external world delivered a chaotic, hostile one. The resulting gap causes a massive spike in cortisol. By adopting the emperor's calibration, you completely eliminate the prediction error. You expect the interference. You anticipate the disrespect. Therefore, when it finally arrives, it does not shock your system. It does not trigger the amygdala hijack. It simply bounces off the heavy, impenetrable bronze shield of your preparation. You look at the person attempting to provoke you, and instead of feeling a burning, righteous anger, you feel a cold, detached indifference. You realize that their actions are entirely predictable, deeply tragic, and utterly powerless to move the heavy center of your mind. You stop giving the remote control of your emotional state to people who cannot even control their own words. You establish the perimeter. But simply calibrating your expectations to the reality of human nature is only the foundation. It prevents the shock, but it does not stop the arrows from flying toward your gates. Once you have accepted the chaotic weather of the world, you must learn exactly how to process the direct impacts when they strike. You must learn the internal architecture of your defense. You have accepted the chaotic weather of the world. You have pre-calibrated your nervous system to expect the treachery, the ignorance, and the venom of unmastered human beings. You have eliminated the biological shock of the prediction error by completely accepting that a toxic mind will inevitably produce toxic behavior. But anticipation is merely the outer perimeter of your defense. It prevents the initial shock, but it does not stop the arrows from flying toward your gates. When the storm finally breaks, when the toxic colleague actually speaks the insult to your face, or when the manipulator actively attempts to drag you into the suffocating mud of their manufactured drama, you must possess the internal architecture to process the strike without bleeding. You must build the second martial discipline, the inner citadel, and the mastery of the sovereign pause. Modern neuroscience and ancient Stoic philosophy converge on a singular, profound truth regarding the nature of human suffering. Between the external stimulus, the harsh word, the betrayal, the overt disrespect, and your internal emotional response, there exists a microscopic, invisible space. For the vast majority of the human population, this space simply does not exist. They operate entirely on pure, unrefined biological reflex. They are insulted, and they instantly, violently react. Their ego is pricked, and they immediately explode with a defensive counterattack. They live their entire lives as tragic, predictable puppets, and the chaotic external world holds all of their strings. To become psychologically lethal, you must take that microscopic space between the stimulus and the response, and you must violently stretch it into a massive, unbridgeable chasm. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively in the dark hours of the night about the concept of the ruling faculty, the sovereign architect of the mind. He understood that a man's psychology must be fortified like a military stronghold. I want you to visualize your mind as a massive ancient castle, constructed of heavy, impenetrable black stone. This is your inner citadel. It is surrounded by high walls, deep trenches, and it is secured by massive, unyielding iron gates. You sit safely inside this fortress on the heavy throne of your own peace. When a toxic person hurls an insult at you, when they attempt to diminish your worth or provoke your anger, their words are nothing more than small, pathetic stones being thrown from the muddy fields far outside your walls. The stone flies through the air, driven by their pathetic insecurity, and it strikes your heavy iron gate. It makes a hollow, insignificant sound, and then it falls harmlessly into the dirt. Listen to the absolute physical reality of this metaphor. The stone has absolutely no power to breach the wall. The words of a fool cannot melt iron. The only possible way for that dirty stone to cause you any internal damage is if you make a catastrophic, exhausting, and entirely voluntary decision. You must choose to walk all the way down from your sovereign throne, physically unlock the heavy iron gates, walk out into the mud, pick up the stone, carry it inside the pristine halls of your own castle, and violently strike yourself in the head with it. In the ancient Stoic tradition, this self-inflicted psychological wound is known as the failure of assent. The external world can only present you with an objective impression. A co-worker saying a sequence of negative words to you is, biologically and physically, nothing more than a vibration of sound waves traveling through the air and hitting your eardrum. That is the cold, objective reality. The suffering, the burning anger, the devastating spike in your blood pressure. All of that is entirely generated by your own mind when you grant your assent to the insult. It happens the exact millisecond you agree with their assessment. When you tell your own nervous system, "I have been harmed by this person," you instantly, physically experience the harm. Marcus Aurelius stated this martial law with brutal, uncompromising clarity. Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been. This is not mere philosophical poetry meant to make you feel better. It is the literal, functional neurobiology of emotional regulation. When you refuse to grant your assent, you are actively, violently interrupting the neural pathway that connects your auditory cortex to your amygdala. You are forcing your prefrontal cortex, the logical, calculating, sovereign architect of your brain, to remain fully online. You are denying the toxic person the absolute privilege of altering your cardiovascular rhythm. Society has conditioned you to believe that defending your honor requires immediate, explosive retaliation. Your unmastered ego screams that if someone disrespects you, you must strike back with a sharper word, a louder voice, and a more devastating argument to prove your strength. You must completely eradicate this illusion. When you argue with a fool, you elevate them to your level, and you degrade yourself to theirs. You are opening the gates of the inner citadel and inviting the filthy, chaotic peasant inside to dirty your floors. True, terrifying strength is the ability to look at the insult, recognize it as a pathetic stone thrown by a weak hand, and simply refuse to pick it up. How do you physically execute this discipline in the chaotic heat of the moment? When the emotional predator is standing directly in front of you, their voice raised, their eyes desperate for the chemical dopamine hit of your reaction, you must deploy the absolute, terrifying stillness of the Shaolin martial artist. You do not flinch. You do not cross your arms in a defensive posture. You do not furrow your brow in anger. You perform a rapid, aggressive physiological override of your own nervous system. You anchor the soles of your feet heavily into the earth, feeling the dense, undeniable gravity pulling you downward. You drop your shoulders, completely releasing the tension stored in your neck. You relax the microscopic muscles in your jaw and around your eyes, creating a facial expression of absolute, chilling neutrality. And most importantly, you seize total dictatorial control of your respiration. When the human body perceives a social threat, the panicked mind breathes shallowly and rapidly into the upper chest, heavily fueling the sympathetic nervous system's fight-or-flight response. You must violently deny this biological reflex. You force the oxygen deep into the bottom of your abdomen, engaging the diaphragm in a slow, heavy, mechanical rhythm. You breathe in deeply. You hold the air in the silence of your chest. You exhale slowly, pushing all the frantic energy out into the floor. By forcing your breathing into this glacial, calculated rhythm, you are sending an undeniable biological signal to your primitive brain that you are completely, absolutely safe. You forcefully activate the parasympathetic nervous system. You lower your heart rate, while the person standing in front of you is practically vibrating with chaotic, unmanaged anxiety. You look directly into their eyes, and you simply watch them. You watch them throw their pathetic stones against your iron gates. You watch them exhaust their limited vocabulary and burn their vital energy, desperately trying to find a crack in your armor. But there is no crack. You have denied them your ascent. You have refused to unlock the gate. You have left them standing entirely alone in the mud of their own manufactured chaos, completely powerless against the cold, heavy stone of your inner citadel. You have built the impenetrable walls. You have mastered the pause between the stimulus and the response, refusing to bleed for the illusions of other people. But preserving your own peace is only the defensive half of emotional sovereignty. To become truly, psychologically lethal, you must learn how to actively use this absolute stillness as a devastating weapon against those who seek to drain you. You must learn the physics of the void. You have successfully fortified the inner citadel. You have learned to anchor your physiology, breathe through the manufactured urgency of the external world, and deny the enemy the satisfaction of your ascent. You have realized that their words are merely stones clattering against heavy iron gates. But true, unshakable emotional sovereignty does not end with merely surviving the attack in silence. To become truly, psychologically lethal, you must learn how to actively use this absolute, terrifying stillness as a devastating weapon against those who actively seek to drain your vital energy. You must learn the devastating physics of the void and how to entirely disarm the emotional predator without lifting a single finger. In the ancient, blood-stained training grounds of the Shaolin Temple, a novice monk initially believes that combat is about clashing force against force. When a massive, heavy opponent charges forward with a violent strike, the untrained mind instinctively raises an arm to block it, attempting to stop a moving boulder with a fragile wall of bone. The result is catastrophic physical trauma. The bone shatters. The energy is entirely absorbed by the defender. But the Grandmaster understands a much deeper, more terrifying law of physics. When the aggressive, heavy opponent charges, the master does not tense his muscles. He does not meet the aggression with equal aggression. Instead, at the exact millisecond of impact, the master completely removes himself from the trajectory of the strike. He fluidly steps to the side, maintaining his own perfect center of gravity, and he becomes the empty void. The aggressive opponent, having committed all of his heavy kinetic energy to striking a solid object, suddenly hits absolutely nothing. His own violent momentum violently pulls his center of gravity forward, dragging him face first into the cold dirt. He defeats himself through the sheer weight of his own unmastered aggression. The master simply watches him fall. You must apply this exact, ruthless martial physics to your psychological warfare. When a manipulator, a narcissist, or a deeply toxic individual attacks you with their words, they are launching a heavy, kinetic, emotional strike. Their entire strategy relies entirely upon the assumption that you will provide the solid wall of bone for them to strike against. They desperately need the friction of your reaction. They need you to get angry, to defend yourself, to raise your voice, or to desperately explain your point of view. When you argue with them, you are catching their strike. You are providing the physical resistance they require to remain standing. The heat of your anger and the desperation in your voice provide their limbic system with a massive, intoxicating hit of dopamine. You are literally feeding their neurobiology. You are fueling their disease with your own vital life force. To become psychologically lethal, you must refuse to be the wall. You must become the void. When they attempt to provoke you, you do not argue. You do not explain yourself. You do not try to convince them of your reality, because a predator has absolutely no interest in the truth. They only have an interest in power. Instead, you deploy the devastating active weapon of absolute indifference. We call this the posture of the cold stare. This is not the silence of a victim who is too afraid to speak. It is the heavy, dominant, predatory silence of an apex sovereign observing a lesser creature thrashing in the mud. You look directly into their eyes. You maintain the glacial, mechanical rhythm of your breathing, anchoring your heart rate deep in the parasympathetic nervous system. You let their toxic words hang in the physical space between you, completely unsupported by your energy. You offer them absolutely nothing. No anger, no agreement, no defense, just an impenetrable, echoing emptiness. Do you understand the profound psychological terror this inflicts upon a manipulator? You are pulling the floor entirely out from underneath their reality. When they throw their heavy, emotional punch and it hits the absolute void of your indifference, their psychological momentum violently pulls them forward. They lose their balance. Their brain, which was heavily anticipating the chemical reward of your suffering, experiences a catastrophic biological failure. They are suddenly forced to hear the pathetic, echoing sound of their own toxic voice in a completely silent room. Without the oxygen of your reaction, their manufactured drama instantly suffocates. They will often experience what behavioral psychologists call an extinction burst. They will panic. They will escalate their behavior, speaking louder, throwing wilder accusations, desperately searching for the button that will finally make you break your discipline. They are drowning, and they are begging you to throw them the lifeline of your anger. You must hold the line of the void. You watch them unravel with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a confused insect trapped inside a glass jar. You do not smile arrogantly, and you do not frown. You remain a blank, heavy slate of stone. And eventually, when their nervous system exhausts its supply of adrenaline and they realize with absolute chilling clarity that they have absolutely zero power over your internal state, they will break. The emotional predator simply cannot survive in a vacuum. They will pack up their chaotic misery and they will retreat, searching the world for an easier, weaker host to drain. By denying them your friction, you have broken them psychologically, and you have not sacrificed a single drop of your own blood to do it. You have achieved the highest echelon of martial mastery, winning the war without ever drawing your sword. You have calibrated your reality to expect the storm. You have built the impenetrable inner citadel to intercept the strike. You have mastered the lethal physics of the void, rendering your enemies completely powerless and letting them collapse under the weight of their own toxic momentum. You have forged a mind that is practically untouchable by the external chaos of the world. But there is one final, agonizingly difficult frontier remaining. The greatest threat to your emotional sovereignty is no longer the toxic people outside your gates. The final enemy is the insidious, deeply comforting whisper hiding in the darkest corners of your own mind. To achieve absolute, unbreakable freedom, we must now march into the execution chamber and face the ultimate illusion where an estimated 99% of humanity completely fails. We must assassinate the most addictive drug known to the human ego. You have calibrated your reality to expect the storm. You have built the impenetrable walls of the inner citadel to intercept the strike, mastering the profound, invisible space between the stimulus and the response. You have mastered the lethal physics of the void, rendering your enemies completely powerless and watching them collapse under the crushing weight of their own toxic momentum. You have forged a mind that is practically untouchable by the external chaos of the world, and you have reclaimed the remote control of your central nervous system. But there is one final, agonizingly difficult frontier remaining. The greatest threat to your emotional sovereignty is no longer the toxic people standing outside your gates. The final enemy is the insidious, deeply comforting whisper hiding in the absolute darkest corners of your own mind. To achieve absolute, unbreakable freedom, we must now march into the execution chamber and face the ultimate illusion, where an estimated 99% of humanity completely fails. We must assassinate the most addictive drug known to the human ego. We must discuss the death of your right to be a victim. Why do the vast majority of people reach the very edge of emotional mastery only to turn around and run back into the burning building of their own suffering? Why do you constantly relapse into complaining, whining, and ruminating over the injustices of your past, even when you know it is destroying your peace? You do this because there is a profound, intoxicating, and deeply pathological comfort in playing the role of the victim. Listen to the dark, undeniable neurobiology of your own ego. When you tell a story about how someone wronged you, when you violently complain to your friends about how terribly you were treated by a toxic colleague or a manipulative partner, your brain receives a very specific, highly addictive chemical reward. It is the dopamine of righteous indignation. You receive the sympathy of your peers. You receive the shallow validation of the crowd. But most importantly, and most destructively, assuming the posture of the victim completely exempts you from the terrifying, heavy burden of absolute responsibility. If it is their fault that you are angry, then you do not have to do the brutal, exhausting labor of building your own emotional discipline. If it is their fault that your day is ruined, then you are completely absolved of the responsibility to regulate your own nervous system. The victim narrative is a warm, heavy blanket that you pull over your eyes to hide from the blinding, terrifying light of your own sovereignty. You trade your absolute power for a few cheap crumbs of pity. To become psychologically lethal, you must perform a violent, unapologetic execution of this identity. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius possessed the absolute power to execute any human being who crossed him. He could have played the victim of assassination plots, betrayals, and political sabotage. Instead, he wrote a single, devastating sentence that completely destroys the foundation of the victim mentality. If you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it. And it is in your power to wipe out this judgment now. I want you to deeply internalize the martial physics of this philosophy. In the ancient training grounds, if a warrior steps onto the battlefield wearing a suit of heavy iron armor, and his opponent strikes him in the chest with a sharp, heavy steel sword, and the sword pierces the armor and cuts the flesh, who is to blame for the wound? The unmastered, pathetic mind points at the opponent and screams, "How dare you strike me with your sword? How dare you be so cruel?" This is an absolute hallucination. The sword is a weapon. The fundamental, undeniable nature of a sword is to cut. That is what it was forged to do. The warrior does not blame the sword for doing its job. The warrior blames the structural integrity of his own armor. If the blade reached your flesh, it is because your defense was weak. Your armor failed. The enemy merely exposed the vulnerability that you neglected to reinforce. When a toxic person insults you, when a chaotic situation arises, and it causes you deep, agonizing emotional pain, you must instantly stop pointing your finger at the external world. You must stop screaming at the sword for being sharp. You must assume a posture of extreme, terrifying ownership. If their words penetrated your peace, it is because your inner citadel was severely compromised. It is because you left the iron gates completely unlocked. It is because your discipline failed. You must take the heavy, burning pain of that interaction and use it to locate the exact crack in your psychology. This level of absolute accountability is the exact threshold where 99% of people drop their weapons and surrender. They simply cannot endure the crushing weight of admitting that they are the architects of their own suffering. They would rather die as a tragic victim than live as a sovereign master. To cross this threshold, you must ruthlessly murder the habit of complaining. You do not complain about the weather. You do not complain about the economy. You absolutely do not complain about the toxic behavior of unmastered human beings. You recognize that complaining is the ultimate vocalization of powerlessness. When you complain, you are literally opening your mouth to broadcast to the entire universe that an external force has dictatorial control over your internal state. You are confessing your weakness to the enemy. From this moment forward, when the friction of the world strikes you, you do not speak a single word of grievance. You absorb the kinetic impact, you analyze the structural failure of your own mind, and you immediately return to the cold forge to reinforce the iron. You seal the breach. You take extreme ownership of every single emotional reaction that occurs inside your biological vessel. By stripping away the right to be a victim, you strip the external world of its ultimate leverage over your soul. You become an impenetrable, self-governing empire of one. I know the heavy, invisible exhaustion you have been carrying in your chest for all these years. I know the profound, quiet tragedy of spending your entire life handing the keys of your kingdom over to thieves, manipulators, and fools. You have bled on 1,000 different battlefields that were never yours to fight. You have spent your precious, irreplaceable life force desperately trying to control the chaotic weather of the external world, while leaving the pristine halls of your own mind completely unguarded. You were taught that being affected by everything was a sign of a good heart. You were lied to. It was a sign of a defenseless city. But the era of your submission is now officially dead. The biological hemorrhage has been stopped. The iron gates of the inner citadel have been forged, raised, and locked. You have calibrated your vision to the brutal reality of human nature. You have mastered the sovereign pause, refusing to grant your assent to the illusions of the weak. You have weaponized the empty void, letting the predators collapse under the weight of their own manufactured drama. And you have violently executed the pathetic, comforting identity of the victim, assuming the terrifying, magnificent weight of absolute responsibility. You have cut the strings of the marionette. You are no longer a puppet of the amygdala. You are no longer a hostage to the toxic projections of a chaotic world. You have become psychologically lethal. The storm is raging outside your walls at this very second. The predators are walking through the world, desperately searching for an unguarded mind to infect. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rises and the world attempts to tie those heavy strings back around your wrists to drag you into the mud of their suffering, what will you do? Will you obediently offer your hands in submission and open the gates to the thieves? Or will you sit heavily on the absolute throne of your citadel, look into the chaotic eyes of the storm, and let them burn to ashes on the outside of your walls? The choice is yours. The path is open. Amituofo.